Hi everyone, this is Merrina again. Welcome back to Reading Better by Atul Gawande with me. Last time we read chapter 9 called The Score, which discussed advancements in obstetrics and how doctors are saving more lives of mothers and babies during child deliveries. And today we're going to read chapter 11 called The Bell Curve. Finding a meaningful way to measure performance, as Virginia Apgar showed was possible in child delivery, is a form of ingenuity in itself. What you actually do with that measure involves another type of ingenuity. However, an improvement ultimately requires both kinds. One person who has understood this is a Minneapolis doctor who has spent 4 decades perfecting care for a single rare and fatal disease. His experience holds a lesson for all of us. In order to tell you his story, though, I need to tell you first about Annie Page, a young girl who was discovered to have the disease. Annie Page's illness began with the kind of small, unexceptional details that mean nothing until seen in hindsight. Like the fact that when she was a baby, her father sometimes called her little potato chip because her skin tasted salty when he kissed her. That is very interesting. Or that Annie's mother noticed that her breathing was sometimes a little wheezy, though the pediatrician heard nothing through his stethoscope. The detail that finally mattered was Annie's size. For a while, Annie's fine-boned petiteness seemed to be just a family trait. Her sister, Lauren, 4 years older, has always been at the bottom end of the pediatrician's growth chart for girls her age. By the time Annie was 3 years old, however, she had fallen off the chart. She stood an acceptable 34 inches tall, but weighed only 23 pounds, less than 98% of girls of her age. She did not look malnourished, but she didn't look quite healthy either. Failure to thrive is what it's called, and there can be scores of explanations. Pituitary disorders, hypothyroidism, genetic defects in metabolism, inflammatory bowel disease, lead poisoning, HIV, tapeworm infection. In textbooks, the complete list is at least a page long. Annie's doctor did a thorough workup. Then, at 4 o'clock on July 27, 1998, I will never forget that day, her mother says. The pediatrician called the Pages at home with the results of a sweat test. It is a funny little test. The skin on the inside surface of a child's forearms is cleaned and dried. 2 small Gates pads are applied, one soaked with pilocarpine, a medicine that makes the skin sweat, and the other one with a salt solution. Electrodes were hooked up. Then a mild electric current is turned on for 5 minutes, driving the pilocarpine into the skin. A reddened, sweaty area about an inch in diameter appeared on the skin, and a collection pad of dry filter paper is taped over it to absorb the sweat for half an hour. The technician then measures the concentration of the chloride in the pad. Over the phone, the doctor told Honor that her daughter's chloride level was far higher than normal. Honor is a hospital pharmacist, and she had come across children with abnormal results like this. All I knew was that it meant she was going to die, she said quietly when I visited the Pages' home in the Cincinnati suburb of Loveland. The test showed that Annie had cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is a genetic disease. Only 1,000 American children per year are diagnosed for having it. Some 10 million people in the United States carry the defective gene, but the disorder is recessive. A child would develop the condition only if both parents are carriers and both carry a copy. The gene, which was discovered in 1989, sitting out on a long arm of the chromosome number 7, produces a mutant protein that interferes with the cell's ability to manage chloride. That's what makes sweat from people with. That's why the sweat from CF people are so salty. Salt is sodium chloride after all. The chloride defect thickens secretion throughout the body, turning them dry and gluey. In the ducts of the pancreas, the flow of digestive enzymes become blocked, making our child less and less likely to absorb food. This was the reason Annie had all but stopped growing. The effects on the lungs, however, are what makes the disease lethal. The thickened mucus slowly fills the small airways and hardens, shrinking lung capacity. Over time, the disease leaves a child with the equivalent of just one functioning lung, then half a lung, and then none at all. The one overwhelming thought in the middle of Honor and Dawn page was, we need to get to Children's. Cincinnati Children's Hospital is among the most respected pediatric hospitals in the country. It was where Albert Sabin invented the oral polio vaccine. The chapter of cystic fibrosis in the Nelson Textbook of Pediatrics, the Bible of the specialty, was written by one of the hospital's pediatricians. The pages called and were given an appointment for the next morning. We were there for hours, meeting with all different members for the team, Honor recalled. They took Annie's blood pressure, measured her oxygen saturation, did some other tests, then they put us in a room. And the pediatrician sat down with us. He was very kind, but frank too. He said, "Do you understand it's a genetic disease? That is nothing you did, nothing you can catch." He told us the median survival for patients was 30 years. In Annie's lifetime, he said, we could see that go to 40. For him, he was sharing a great accomplishment in CF care, and the news was better than our worst fear. But only 40. That's not what we want to hear. The team members reviewed the treatments. The pages were told that they would have to give Annie pancreatic enzyme pills with the first bite of every meal. They would have to give her supplemental vitamins. They also had to add calories wherever they could, putting tablespoons of butter on everything, giving her ice cream whenever she wanted, and then putting chocolate sauce on top of it. Wow, on first thought, this seems like a dream, like you can eat all that calorie-rich food for if you have this disease, but it is also unfortunate that she is not expected to live very long. A respiratory therapist explained that they will need to do manual chest therapy at least twice a day, half-hour sessions in which they would strike their daughters' torsos with a cupped hand at each of 14 specific locations on the front, back, and sides in order to loosen the thick secretions and help her cough them up. They were given prescriptions for inhaled medicine. The doctor told them that Annie would need to come back once every 3 months for extended checkups. Then they went home to start their new life. They had been told almost everything they need to know in order to give Annie the best chance to live as long as possible. The one thing that the clinicians failed to tell them, however, was that Cincinnati's Children's was not, as the pages supposed, among the country's top centers for children with cystic fibrosis. According to data from that year, it was at best an average program. This was no small matter. In 1997, patients at an average center were living to be just over 30 years old. Patients at the top centers typically lived to be 46. By some measures, Cincinnati was well below average. The best predictor of a CF patient's life expectancy is his or her lung infection. At Cincinnati, the lung infection achieved by patients under the age of 12, children like Annie's, remained in the bottom 25% of the country's CF patients, and the doctors there knew it. It used to be assumed that differences between hospitals and doctors in a particular specialty were generally insignificant. If you plotted a graph showing the result of all the centers treating cystic fibrosis, or any other disease for that matter, people expected that the curve would look something like a shark fin. Here, this is what it looks like. So it goes up very sharply and then goes down very sharply. With most places clustered around the very best outcomes, but evidence has begun to indicate otherwise. What you tend to see is a bell curve. I think you're very familiar with this. With a handful of teams showing disturbingly poor outcomes for their patients, a handful obtaining remarkably good results, and a great undistinguished middle. After an ordinary hernia operation, for example, the chances a patient will have a recurrent hernia are 1 in 10, with surgeons at the unhappy end of the spectrum, 1 in 20 for those in the middle majority, and 1 in 500 with the elite handful. For newborns admitted to a neonatal intensive care unit, the risk-adjusted death rate averages 10%, but varies from 6 to 16%, depends on the center. For women undergoing in vitro fertilization, the likelihood of successful pregnancy from a given attempt at implanting a fertilized embryo is around 40% for most centers, but ranges from under 15% to over 65%, depending on where they go. Differences in the age of patients a center sees, its willingness to accept high-risk patients, and other factors certainly account for some of those variability. Nonetheless, for a given patient, there are wide, meaningful differences among centers, and a few are simply better than the rest. This is an interesting point because even though we do not like to hear about it, some doctors are just better and some places are just more equipped at treating people. I remember when I had like a chronic injury, I had to go to all sorts of hospitals and try to go to the better ones because I know I will have a better chance at receiving better care and recovering from it if I can see one of the best doctors. The bell curve is distressing for doctors to have to acknowledge. It belies the promise that we make to patients that they can count on the medical system to give them the very best chance. It also contradicts the belief nearly all of us have that we're doing our job as well as it could be done. But evidence of the bell curve is starting to trickle out to doctors and patients alike, and we're only beginning to find out what happens when it does. In medicine, we are used to confront failures. All doctors have unforeseen deaths and complications. What we are not used to doing is comparing our records of success and failures with those of our peers. I am a surgeon in a department that is, our members like to believe, one of the best in the country. But the truth is, we have had no reliable evidence about whether we are as good as we think we are. Baseball teams have win-loss records. Businesses have quarterly earning reports. What about doctors? There is a company on the web called Health Grades, which for $17.95 will give you a report card on any physician you choose. Not long ago, I requested the company's report cards on me and several of my colleagues. They don't tell you that much. You will learn, for instance, that I'm certified in my specialty, have no criminal convictions, have not been fired from any hospital, have not had my license suspended or revoked, and had not been disciplined for misconduct. This is no doubt useful to know, but it sets the bar a tad low, doesn't it? In recent years, there has been a proliferation of efforts to measure how various hospitals and doctors perform. No one has found the task easy. One difficulty has been figuring out what to measure. For 6 years, from 1986 to 1992, the federal government released an annual report that came out to be the death list. It ranked all the hospitals in the country by their death rate for the elderly and disabled patients on Medicare. The spread was alarmingly wide, and the death list made headlines the first year it came out, but the rankings proved to be almost useless. Death among the elderly or disabled mostly has to do with how old or sick they are to begin with. Then the statisticians could never work out how to apportion blame between nature and doctors. Volatility in the number was one sign of trouble. Hospitals' rankings seesaw dramatically from one year to another due to the handful of random deaths. It was unclear what kind of changes would improve their performance, other than sending their sickest patients to other hospitals. Pretty soon the public simply ignored the rankings. Even with younger patients, death rates are a poor metric for how doctors do. After all, very few young patients die, and when they do, it is rarely a surprise. Most already have metastatic cancer or horrendous injuries or the like. What one really wants to know is how we perform in a typical circumstance. Some kind of score for the immediate results, perhaps, and also a measure for the processes involved. For patients with pneumonia, how often does my hospital get them the correct antibiotic? And on the whole, how do they do? How do our results compare with those of other hospitals? Gathering this kind of data can be difficult. Medicine still relies heavily on paper records, so to collect information you have to send people to either scour the charts or track the patients themselves, both of which are expensive and laborious propositions. Recent privacy regulations have made the task still harder, yet it is start being done. The country's veterans hospitals have all now brought in staff who do nothing but record and compare surgeon complication rates and death rates. 14 teaching hospitals, including my own, have recently joined together to do the same. California, New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania have been collecting and reporting data on every cardiac surgeon in their state for years. This is something to really think about because students like me, we are compared between each other based on our grades and our GPAs and standardized testing scores. But doctors' performance on their patients, that can be pretty tricky to measure. So I'm interested in seeing more of how this is being done right now. One small field in medicine has been far ahead of most others in measuring the results its practitioners achieve: cystic fibrosis care. For 40 years, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation has gathered detailed data from the country's cystic fibrosis treatment centers. It did so not because it is more enlightened than everyone else, but because in the 1960s, a pediatrician from Cleveland named Leroy Matthews was driving people in the field crazy. Matthews had started a cystic fibrosis treatment program as a young pulmonary specialist at Babies and Children's Hospitals in Cleveland in 1957, and within a few years was claiming to have an annual mortality rate of less than 2%. To anyone treating CF at that time, this was a preposterous assertion. National mortality rates for the disease were estimated to be higher than 20% a year, and the average patient died by the age of 3. Yet here was Matthews saying that he and his colleagues could stop the disease from doing serious harm for years. How long our patients will live remains to be seen, but I expect most of them to come to my funeral, he told one conference of physicians. This seems like he's very confident of himself. Let's see if his claims are actually true. In 1964, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation gave a University of Minnesota pediatrician named Warren Warwick a modest budget of $10,000 to collect reports on every patient treated at the 31 CF centers in the United States that year, data that would test Matthew's claim. Several months later, he had the results. The median estimated age at death for patients in Matthew's Center was 21 years, 7 times the age of patients treated everywhere else. Matthews was what we now call a positive deviant. He had not had a single death among patients younger than 6 in at least 5 years. Unlike pediatricians elsewhere, Matthews viewed CF not as a sudden affliction, but as an accumulative disease and provided aggressive prevention treatment to starve it off long before the patient became visibly sick from it. He made his patients sleep each night in a plastic tent filled with a continuous aerosolized water mist so dense that you can barely see through it. This thinned the tenacious mucus that clogged their airways, enabling them to cough it up. Using an innovation of British pediatricians, he had also family members clap on the children's chest daily to help loosen the mucus. After Warwick's report came out, Matthew's treatment quickly became the standard in the country. The American Thoracic Society endorsed his approach, and Warwick's data registry on treatment centers proved so useful that the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation continued using it ever since. Looking at the data over time is both fascinating and disconcerting. By 1966, mortality from CF nationally had dropped so much that the average life expectancy of CF patients had already reached 10 years. By 1972, it was 18 years, a rapid and remarkable transformation. At the same time, though, Matthew's Center had gotten even better. The foundation never identified individual centers in its data to ensure participation. It guaranteed anonymity. But Matthew's Center published its results. By the early 1970s, 95% of patients who had gone there before severe lung disease set in were living past their 18th birthday. There was a bell curve, and the spread had narrowed a little. Yet every time the average moved up, Matthews and a few others somehow managed to stay ahead of the pack. In 2003, life expectancy with CF had risen to 33 years nationally, but at the best center it was more than 47. Experts have become as leery of life expectancy calculations as they are of hospital death rates. But other measures tell the same story. For example, at the median center, lung infection for patients with CF, the best predictor of survival, is about 3/4 of what it is for people without CF. At the top centers, the average lung infection of patients is indistinguishable from that of children who do not have CF. Some allege that the differences are explained simply by the differences in the specific gene patients inherited or by the social class of their families. But according to a recent study, such factors, even taken together, explain at best 1/4 of the variability, and nothing about how some centers have kept their average CF patients as normal as children without the disease. What makes the wide variability especially puzzling is that our system for CF care is so much more sophisticated than that for other diseases. CF care works the way we want all of medicine to work. Patients receive care in one of 117 ultra-specialized centers across the country All centers undergo a rigorous certification process. Their doctors have a high volume of experience in caring for people with CF. They all follow the same guidelines for CF treatment, guidelines that are far more detailed than we have in most of medicine. They all participate in research trials to figure out new and better treatment. You would think, therefore, that their results would be much the same. Yet the differences are enormous. Patients have not known this. So what happens when they find out? I think that if patients know that certain places are just better than others, they would just all go to those, better places. And the centers that are like lower on the bell curve spectrum might not receive as many patients. But maybe they will lower their cost for care, so people would try to go there. Let's see if my prediction came true. In the winter of 2001, the Pages and 20 other families were invited by their doctors at Cincinnati Children's to a meeting about the CF program here. Annie was 7 years old now, a lively second grader. She was still not growing enough, and a simple cold would be hellish for her. But her lung function had been stable. The family gathered in a large conference room at the hospital. After a brief introduction, the doctor started flashing PowerPoint slides on the screen. Here is how the top programs do on nutrition and respiratory performance, and here is how Cincinnati does. It was a kind of experiment in openness. The doctors were nervous. Some were opposed to having the meeting at all, but hospital leaders had insisted on going ahead. The reason was Don Berwick. Berwick is a former pediatrician who runs a nonprofit organization in Boston called the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. The Institute has provided multi-million-dollar grants to hospitals that are willing to try his idea for improving medical practice. Cincinnati's CF program won one of those grants, and among Berwick's key stipulations was that the recipient had to open up their information to the patients to go naked, as the doctor put it. Berwick was an unusual figure in medicine. In 2002, in the industry publication Modern Healthcare listed him as the third most powerful person in American healthcare. Unlike the others on the list, he is powerful not because of the position he holds. The Secretary of Health and Human Services was number 1, and the head of the Medicare and Medicaid was number 2. He is powerful because of how he thinks. At a conference in December 1999, Berwick gave a 40-minute speech distilling his ideas about the failings of American healthcare. Years afterward, people are still talking about the speech. The video of it circulated like samizdat. That's how I saw it, on a grainy, overplayed VHS tape about 1 year later. A booklet with transcripts was sent to thousands of doctors around the country. Berwick is a middle-aged, soft-spoken, and unprepossessing, and he knows how to use his apparent ordinarities to his advantage. He began his speech with a gripping story about a 1949 Montana forest fire that engulfed a parachute brigade of firefighters. Panicking, they run, trying to make it up a 76% grade and over a crest to safety. But their commander, a man named Wag Dodge, saw that their plan wasn't going to work. So he stopped, took out some matches, and set the dry grass ahead of him on fire. The new blaze caught and rapidly spread around the slope. He stepped into the middle of the burned-out area it left behind, laid down, and called his crew to join him. He had invented on the spot what came to be called an escape fire, and it later became a standard part of Forest Service fire training. His men, however, either thought he was crazy or never heard his calls, and they ran past him. About 2 were caught by the inferno and perished. Inside his escape fire, Dodge survived virtually unharmed. As Berwick explained, the firefighters' organization had unraveled. The men had lost their ability to think coherently, to act together, and to recognize that a life-saving idea might be possible. This is what happens to all flawed organizations in a disaster, and he argued this is what is happening in modern healthcare. As medicine tries to cope with the advancing complexity of knowledge and treatment, it is falling short in performing even the simplest of its tasks. To fix medicine, Berwick maintained, we need to do 2 things. We should be routinely comparing the performance of doctors and hospitals, looking at everything from surgical complication rates to how often a drug ordered for a patient is delivered correctly and on time. And, he insisted, hospitals should give patients total access of the information. No secrets is the new rule in my escape fire, he said. He argues that openness would drive improvement. If simply through embarrassment, it would make it clear that the well-being and convenience of the patients, not the doctors, were paramount. It would also serve a fundamental moral good, because people should be able to learn about anything that affects their life. I really agree with his philosophy. The patients are the customers, and they deserve to know the truth. They deserve to know whether their doctors are actually good enough for them. Berwick's Institute was given serious money from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to offer to those who used his ideas. And so the doctors, nurses, and social workers of Cincinnati Children's stood uncertainly before a crowd of patients' families in the hospital's conference room, told them how poorly the program's results ranked, and announced a plan for doing better. Surprisingly, not a single family chose to leave the program. We thought about it after the meeting, Ralph Blackwilder said. He and his wife, Tracy, have 8 children, 4 of whom have CF. We thought maybe we should move. Maybe we could sell my business here and start a business somewhere else. We were thinking, why would I want my kid to be seen here with inferior care? I want the very best people to be helping my children. But he and Tracy were impressed that the team had told them the truth. No one at Cincinnati's Children's had made any excuses, and everyone appeared desperate to do more. The Blackwilders had known these people for years. The program's nutritionist, Terry Schindler, had a child of her own in the program. Their pulmonary specialist, Barbara Chinney, had been smart, attentive, and loving, taking their late-night phone calls, seeing children through terrible crises, instituting new therapies as they became available. The program director, Jim Acton, made a personal promise that there would soon be no better treatment center in the world. This is interesting because it ties to something else I've read in this book. It says that when surgeons make mistakes on their procedures, if they just tell the patients honestly that they made a mistake, then the patients are actually less likely to sue the doctor later if they found out, because being truthful is a better approach than like hiding your mistake and then making the patients think that you're hiding things from them. Honor Page was alarmed when she saw the numbers. Like the Blackwilders, the Pages had a close relationship with the team at Children's, but the news tested their loyalty. Acton announced the formation of several committees that would work to improve the program's results. Each committee, he said, had to have at least one parent on it. This is unusual. Hospitals seldomly allow patients and families on internal review committee. So, rather than walk away, Honor decided to sign up for the committee that would re-examine the science behind patient care. Her committee was puzzled that the center's results were not better. Not only had the center followed national guidelines for CF, but 2 of its physicians have helped write them. The committee wanted to visit the top centers, but no one knew which those were, although the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation's annual report displayed the individual results for each of the country's 117 centers. No names were attached. Doctors put in a call and sent emails to the foundation, asking for the name of the top 5, but to no avail. Several months later, in early 2002, Don Berwick visited the Cincinnati program. He was impressed by its sincere desire to improve and by the intense involvement of the families, but he was incredulous when he learned that the committee couldn't get the names of the top programs from the foundation. He called the foundation's chief executive vice president for medical affairs, Preston Campbell, who reacted with instinctive caution. The centers, he tried to explain, gave their data voluntarily. The reason they had done so for 40 years is that they have trusted that the data would be kept confidential. Once the centers lose that faith, they might no longer report solid information tracking how different treatments are working and how well they do. Campbell is a deliberate and thoughtful man, a pediatric pulmonologist who had devoted his career to cystic fibrosis patients. The discussion with Berwick had left him uneasy. The Cystic Fibrosis Foundation had always been dedicated to the value of research. By investing in bench science, it had helped decode the gene for cystic fibrosis, produce 2 new drugs approved for patients, and generate more than a dozen other drugs that are currently being tested. Its investments in tracking patient care had resulted in scores of valuable studies that had resulted in new guidelines, tighter standards for certification, more regularized care. Yet their research also showed that their patients continued to get care of widely differing quality. A couple of weeks after Berwick's phone call, Campbell released the names of the top 5 centers to Cincinnati. Indeed, he had become himself persuaded that further improvement would come only through greater transparency. In 2004, the foundation announced a goal of eventually making the outcomes of every center publicly available, but it insisted it needed time to achieve this. Only a few of the nation's CF treatment centers have actually agreed to go public. I can see how this is different. This is difficult for all of the list of cystic fibrosis programs to be transparent because, well, the top programs will be like very happy that people now acknowledge how good they are. The programs at the bottom, they are gonna feel ashamed that they're not doing as well. This is just the same like for all of our classes. Like I don't want to know that I am on the bottom of the on the class, but if I'm on the top, then like making myself known is not that big of a deal. Still, after traveling to one of the top 5 centers for a look, I found I could not avoid naming the center I saw. No obscure physicians' identities or glossing over details. There was simply no way to explain what a great center did without the particulars. The people from Cincinnati found this too. Within months of learning which the top 5 centers were, they had spoken to people at each and then visited what they considered to be the best one. Minnesota Cystic Fibrosis Center at Fairfield University Children's Hospital in Minneapolis. I went first to Cincinnati and then to Minneapolis for comparison. What I saw in Cincinnati both impressed me and gave it middle ranking. given its middle ranking, surprised me. The members of the CF staff were skilled, energetic, and dedicated. They had just completed a flu vaccination campaign that had reached more than 90% of their patients. Before clinic visits, patients filled out questionnaires so that the team would be better prepared for the questions they would have and the services such as x-rays, tests, and specialist consultations they would need. Before patients went home, the doctors gave them a written summary of their visit and a complete copy of their record, something that I had never thought to do in my own practice. I joined Corey Danes, one of the 7 CF care specialists, in her clinic one morning. Among the patients we saw was Lisa. She was 15 years old, freckled, skinny, with nails painted loud red, straight sandy blonde hair tied in a ponytail, a soda in one hand, legs crossed, foot bouncing constantly. Every few minutes she gave a short, throaty cough. Her parents sat on one side. All the questions were directed to her. How has she been doing? How was school going? Any breathing difficulties? Trouble keeping up with her calories? Her answers were monosyllabic at first, but Danes have known Alyssa for years, and slowly she opened up. Things had mostly been going right, she said. She had been sticking with her treatment regime, twice a day manual chest therapy by one of her parents, inhaled medication using nebulizer immediately afterward, and vitamins. Her lung infection had been measured. That morning it was 67% of normal, slightly down from her usual 80%. Her cough had got a little worse the day before, and this was thought to be the reason for the dip. Danes was concerned about the stomach pains that Alyssa had been having for several months. The pains came out unpredictably, Alyssa said. Before meals, after meals, in the middle of the night. They were sharp and persisted up to a couple of hours. Examinations, tests, and x-rays had found no abnormalities, but she had stayed home from school for the past 5 weeks. Her parents, exasperated because she seemed fine most of the time, wondered if the pain could be just in her head. Danes wasn't sure. She asked the staff nurse to check in with Alyssa at home, arranged for a consultation with a gastroenterologist and with a pain specialist, and scheduled an earlier return visit than the usual 3 months. This was, it seemed to me, real medicine. Untidy, human, but practiced carefully and conscientiously, as well as anyone could ask for. Then I went to Minneapolis. The director of Fairview University Children's Hospital Cystic Fibrosis Center was almost 40 years had been none other than Warren Warwick, the pediatrician who had conducted the study of Leroy Matthews' suspiciously high success rate. Ever since then, Warwick had made a study of what it takes to do better than everyone else. The secret, he insists, is simple, as he learned from the Matthews. Do what you can to keep your patient's lung as open as possible. Patients with CF at Fairview got the same things that patients everywhere else got. Some nebulized treatments to loosen secretion and unclog passageways, a kind of mist tent in a mouth pipe, antibiotics, a good thumping on their chest every day, yet somehow everything Warwick did was different. In the clinic one afternoon, I joined him as he saw a 17-year-old high school senior called Janelle, who had been diagnosed with CF at the age of 6 and had been under his care ever since. She had come for her routine 3-month checkup. She wore dyed black hair to her shoulder blades, black Avril Lavigne eyeliners, 4 earrings in each ear, 2 more in an eyebrow, and a stud in her tongue. Warwick was 76 years old, tall, stooped, and frumpy-looking, with a well-worn tweed jacket, liver spots dotting his skin, wispy gray hair, by all appearance a doddering mid-century academic. He stood in front of Janelle for a moment, hands on his hips, looking her over. Then he said, "So, Janelle, what have you been doing to making sure that we're the best CF program in the country?" "It's not easy, you know," she said. They bantered. She was doing fine. School was going well. Warwick pulled out her latest lung infection measurement. There had been a slight dip, as there was with Alyssa. 3 months earlier, Janelle had been at 109%. She was actually doing better than the average children without CF. Now she was around 90%. That was still pretty good, and some ups and downs in the numbers are to be expected, but this was not the way Warwick saw the results. He knitted his eyebrows. "Why did they go down?" he asked. Janelle shrugged. "Any coughs lately?" "No." "Colds?" "No." "Fevers?" "No." Was she sure that she has been taking her treatments regularly? "Yes, of course." "Every day?" "Yes." "Did she ever miss treatments?" "Sure, everyone does once in a while." "However is this once in a while?" Then slowly, Warwick got a different story out of her. In the past few months, it turned out, she had barely been taking her treatment at all. He pressed on. "Why aren't you taking your treatments?" He appeared neither surprised or angry. He seemed genuinely curious, as if he had never run across in this interesting situation before. "I don't know," he kept pushing. "What keeps you from doing your treatments?" "I don't know." "Up here." He pointed at his own head. "What is going on?" "I don't know," she said. He paused for a moment. Then he turned to me, taking a new track. "The thing about patients with CF is that they are good scientists," he said. "They always experiment. We have to help them interpret what they experience as they experiment. So they stop doing their treatments, and what happens? They don't get sick. Therefore, they conclude Dr. Warwick is nuts." "But let's look at the numbers," he said to me, ignoring Janelle. He went to a little blackboard he had on the wall. It appeared to be well used. A person's daily risk of getting a bad lung illness with CF is 0.5%. He wrote the number down. Janelle rolled her eyes. She began tapping her foot. "The daily risk of getting a bad lung infection with CF plus treatment is 0.05%, he went on, and he wrote that number down. "So when you experiment, you're looking at the difference between 99.5% chance of staying well and a 99.95 chance of staying well. Seems hardly any difference, right? On any given day, you have basically 100% chance of being well. But," he paused and took a step toward me, "it is a big difference." He chalked out the calculations. "Sum it up over a year, and it is the difference between an 83% chance of making it through the year without getting sick and only 16% chance." He turned to Janelle. How do you stay well all your life? How do you become a geriatric patient?" he asked her. Her foot finally stopped tapping. "I can't promise you anything. I can only tell you the odds." In this short speech, I realized, was the core of Warwick's worldview. He believed that excellence came from seeing, on a daily basis, the difference between being 99.9% successful and being 99.95% successful. Many things human beings do are like that, of course. Catching fly balls, manufacturing microchips, delivering overnight packages. Medicine's distinction is that lives are lost in those slim margins. And so he went back to work on finding that margin for Janelle. Eventually, he figured out that she had a new boyfriend. She had a new job too and was working night shifts. The boyfriend has his own apartment, and she was either there or at a friend's house most of the time. And she was either so she rarely made it home to take her treatments. At school, new rules required her to go to the nurse for each dose of the medication during the day, so she skipped going. It's such a pain, she said. He learned that there were some medications she took and some she didn't. One she took because it was the only thing she felt that actually made a difference. She took her vitamins too. Why your vitamins? Because they're cool. The rest she ignored. This feels like a regular teenager, trying to revolt, doesn't want to listen to the parents or the doctors. So I think it's kind of difficult to make them understand that they have to follow the treatment plans. Otherwise, you're gonna hurt yourself in the long term. Warwick proposed a deal. Janelle would go home for a breathing treatment every day after school and get her best friend to hold her to it. She'd also keep medications in her bag or her pocket at school and take them on their own. The nurse won't let me. Don't tell her, he said, and deftly turned taking care of herself into an act of rebellion. That is very clever because this girl seems to like the idea of rebelling against the doctor, against the nurse. So now he's telling her to rebel by taking medications. So far, Janelle was okay with this, but there was one other thing. He said she'd have to come to the hospital for a few days of therapy to recover the lost ground. She stared at him. Today? Yes, today. How about tomorrow? We've failed, Janelle, he said. It's important to acknowledge when we failed. With that, she began to cry. Warwick's combination of focus, aggressiveness, and inventiveness is what makes him extraordinary. He thinks hard about his patients, he pushes them, and he does not hesitate to improvise. 20 years ago, while he was listening to a church choir and mulling over how he might examine his patients better, he came up with a new stethoscope, a stereo stethoscope, he calls it. It has two bells dangling from it, and because of a built-in sound delay, transmits long sounds in stereo. He had an engineer make it for him. Listening to Janelle with the instrument, he put one bell on the right side of her chest and the other on her left side, and insisted that he could systematically localize how individual lobes of her lungs sounded. He invented a new cough. It wasn't enough that his patients actively coughed up their sputum. He wanted a deeper, better cough. And later in his office, Warwick made another patient practice this cough. The patient stretched his arms upward, yawned, pinched his nose, bent down as far as he could, let the pressure build up, and then, straightening up, blasted everything out. Again, Warwick encouraged him. Harder. He produced the most far-reaching invention almost 2 decades ago. A mechanized chest-thumping vest for patients to wear. The chief difficulty for a patient with CF is sticking with the laborious daily regime of care, particularly the manual chest therapy. It requires another person's help. It requires conscientiousness, making sure to bang on each of the 14 locations on the patient's chest. And it requires consistency, doing it twice a day, every single day, year after year. Warwick had become fascinated by studies showing that inflating and deflating a blood pressure cuff around a dog's chest could mobilize its lung secretions, and in the mid-1980s he created what is now called the vest. It looked like a black flak jacket with 2 vacuum hoses coming out from the sides. These are hooked up to a compressor that shoots quick blasts of air in and out of the vest at high frequencies. I talked to a patient while he had one of those on. He vibrated like a car on a rutted back road. Studies eventually showed that Warwick's device was at least as effective as the manual chest therapy and was used far more consistently. Today, 45,000 patients with CF and other lung diseases use this technology. Like most other medical clinics, the Minnesota Cystic Fibrosis Center have several physicians and many more staff members. Warwick established a weekly meeting to review everyone's care for their patients, and he insists on a degree of uniformity that clinicians usually find intolerable. Some chafe he can have, as one doctor put it, somewhat of an absence of collegial respect for different care plans. And although he stepped down as director of the center in 1999 to let a prodigy, Carlos Mila, take over, he remains its guiding spirit. He and his colleagues aren't content if their patient's lung infection is 80% of normal, or even 90%. They aim for 100%, or better. Almost 10% of the children at his center get supplemental feeding through a latex tube surgically inserted to their stomachs. Wow, simply because by Warwick's standards, they're not gaining enough weight. There's no published research showing that you need to do this, but not a single child or teenager at the center had died in almost a decade. The oldest patient is now 67. Oh my gosh. It is mind-blowing to think that these patients need to take in extra calories because their bodies are incapable of absorbing enough nutrients. I've heard of like bariatric surgeries that like kind of bypass your intestines to treat people with obesity, but it is kind of the reverse for these patients because they need to like have more food inserted into their bodies. But I am impressed by like all the extra steps that these doctors are willing to take to make sure that their patients are getting their best chance of surviving this disease. In medicine, we have learned to appreciate the danger of ad hoc experimentation on patients of cowboy physicians. We endeavor to stick to established findings. But with his unblinking focus on his patients' actual results, Warwick has been able to innovate successfully. And he has become almost contemptuous of established findings. National clinical guidelines for care are, he says, a record of the past, and little more. They should have an expiration date. I accompanied him as he visited another of his patients, Scott Piper. When Piper came to Fairville at the age of 32, he had lost at least 80% of his lung capacity. He was too weak and short of breath to take a walk, let alone work, and he was not expected to last a year. That was 14 years ago. Some days I think, this is it, I'm not going to make it, Piper told me. But other days I think, I'm going to make it to 60, 70, maybe even more. For the past several months, Warwick had Piper trying a new idea, wearing his vest not only for two daily 30-minute sessions, but also while napping for 2 hours in the middle of the day. Falling asleep in that shuddering thing took some getting used to, but Piper was soon able to take up bowling, his first regular activity in years. He joined a 2-night-a-week league. He couldn't go 4 games, and his score always dropped in the 3rd game, but he'd worked his average up to 177. Any ideas about what we could do so you could last for that extra game, Scott? Warwick asked. Well, Piper said, he had noticed that in the cold, anything below 50 degrees and when humidity was below 50%, he did better. Warwick suggested doing an extra hour in the vest on warm or humid days and on every game day. Piper said he'd try it. We're used to thinking that a doctor's ability depends mainly on science and skills. The lesson from from Minneapolis, and indeed from battlefield medical tents in Iraq, villages with outbreaks of polio, birthing rooms across the country, and all the other places I've described in this book, is that these may be the easiest part of care. Even doctors with great knowledge and technical skill can have mediocre results. More nebulous factors like aggressiveness and diligence and ingenuity can matter enormously. In Cincinnati and in Minneapolis, the doctors are equally capable and well-versed in the data on CF. But if Annie Page, who had no breathing problems or major setbacks, were in Minneapolis, she would almost certainly have had a feeding tube in her stomach, and Warwick's team hunting her to figure out ways to make her breathing even better than normal. Don Berwick believes that the subtleties of high-performance medical practice can be identified and learned, but the lessons are hidden because no one knows who the high performers really are. Only if we knew the results from all can we identify the positive deviants and learn from them. If we are genuinely curious about how the best achieve their results, Berwick believes, then the ideas will spread. The test of Berwick's theory is now underway. In December 2006, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation succeeded in persuading centers to make public their individual results, adjusted for the severity of the disease in their populations. The information is now posted for all to see on the Foundation website, www.cff.org, the first field in medicine to voluntarily do such a thing. The Cincinnati CF team had already begun monitoring the nutrition and lung infection of individual patients the way Warwick does. And it is getting more aggressive about pushing the results higher. Yet you have to wonder whether it is possible to replicate people like Warwick, with their intense drive and constant experimenting. In the few years since the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation began bringing together centers willing to share their idea, certain patterns have begun to emerge. According to Bruce Marshall, the head of quality improvement for the program, although centers appear to have made significant progress, none, however, have progressed more than a center like Fairview. You look at the rates of improvement in different quartiles, and it is centers in the top quartile that are improving the fastest. Marshall says they are at risk of breaking away. What the best may be, above all, is capacity to learn and change, and to do so faster than everything else. Once we acknowledge that, no matter how much we improve our average, the bell curve isn't going away. We are left with all sorts of questions. Will being in the bottom half be used against doctors? Will we be expected to tell patients how we score? Will patients leave us? Will those at the bottom be paid less than those at the top? The answer to all these questions is likely yes. So I think there is competition in every field, like if you are, say, a CEO, if you are just better at your job, then you get more bonus than CEOs at other companies who don't perform as well, So these incentives can seem like, they're making people who are not as good, like they're shaming those people. But at the same time, without those standards, we don't have enough incentive to strive to be the best of ourselves. Recently, for example, there has been a rapid shift toward paying for quality, No one ever says docking for mediocrity, but it amounts to the same thing. Across the country, insurers like Medicare, Aetna, and Blue Cross Blue Shield companies now hold back 10% or more of payments to physicians until specific quality goals are met. Medicare has decided not to pay surgeons for intestinal transplantation operations unless the doctors achieve a predefined success rate, and it may extend the practice to do other procedures. Not surprisingly, this makes doctors so anxious. I once said in a presentation of the concept to an audience of doctors hearing about it for the first time. By the end, some in the crowd were practically shouting with indignation, "We're going to be paid according to our grades. Who is doing the grading? For God's sake, how?" We in medicine are not the only ones being graded nowadays. Firefighters, CEOs, and salesmen are. Even teachers are being graded, and in some places being paid accordingly. Yet we all feel uneasy about being judged by such grades. They never seem to measure the right things. They don't take into account circumstances beyond our control. They are misused. They are unfair. Still, the simple facts remain. There is a bell curve in all human activities, and the differences you measure are usually matter. I asked Honor Page what she would do after all her efforts and the efforts the doctors and nurses at Cincinnati Children's Hospital to ensure that there was no place better in the world to receive cystic fibrosis care, the program's comparative performance still rated as resoundingly average. "I can't believe that's possible," she told me. "The staff have worked so hard," she said, "that she could not imagine they would fail." After I pressed her, though, she told me, "I don't think I'd settle for Cincinnati if it remained just average." Then she thought about it some more. Would she really move Annie away from people who had been so devoted all these years, just because of the numbers? Well, maybe. But at the same time, she wanted me to understand that their efforts counted for more than she was able to express. I do not have to consider these matters for very long before I start thinking about where I would stand on a bell curve for the operations I do. In my area of specialization, surgery for endocrine tumors, I would hope that my statistics prove to be better than those of surgeons who only occasionally do these kind of surgeries. But am I up in the Wawekian territory? Do I have to answer these questions? The hardest question for anyone who takes responsibility for what he or she does is, what if I turn out to be average? If we took all the surgeons and my level of experience, compared our results, and discovered that I'm one of the worst, the answer would be easy. I would turn in my scalpel. What if I were a B+, working as I do in a city that is mobbed with surgeons? How could I justify putting patients under the knife? I could tell myself, somebody's got to be average. If the bell curve is a fact, then so is the reality that most doctors are going to be average. If there is no shame in being one of them, right? Except, of course, there is. What is troubling is not just being average, but settling for it. Everyone knows that averageness is, for most of us, our fate, and in certain matters, looks, money, we would all do well to accept this. But in your surgeon, your daughter's, your child's pediatrician, your police department, your local high school, when the stakes are our lives and the lives of our children, we want no one to settle for average.